Raise your hand if you've ever lied to anyone at some point in your life. Please raise your hand if you've ever cheated on an intimate partner. Raise your hand if at some point in your lifetime you've been responsible for causing another person harm. Unfortunately, we live in a world where harm is ever present in our lives. When I stare in the proverbial eye of history, I readily see that human beings are no strangers to the concept of harm, both on a proximal level as well as a structural level. For instance, the Parkland High School shooting, the transatlantic slave trade, and the system of mass incarceration. What is harm? Harm is both physical and mental injury. Harm is also something that causes someone or something to feel hurt, broken, less than. Harm. The question I ask you to ask yourself, what is harm? Mass incarceration, the transatlantic slave trade, the Parkland shooting. February 18th, 2018, February 14th, 2018, excuse me, Nicholas Cruz, armed with an AR-15, into Majority Stoneman Douglas High School. He shot and killed 17 people and injured 17 more. 17 lives were extinguished and taken from our constellation of humanity, promise, and opportunity. 17 lives were lost because of one person's harm. However, those 17 lives were part of a greater ecosystem of family, friends, and dreams. Dreams that will never see fulfillment because of harm. Harm that we, as a nation, are still wrestling with as we try to figure out how do we heal from the transatlantic slave trade? How do we heal from a broken criminal legal system that criminalizes poverty? Poverty. Unfortunately, it is no longer a little known fact. It is known widely that poverty are often found too many times in the black and brown communities. And these communities are over-policed and over-incarcerated as a result. Again, poverty, criminalization, mass incarceration. Our criminal legal system currently incarcerates 1.9 million people. Another 4.9 million people formerly incarcerated are on parole or probation. Another 19 million have been convicted of a felon. 79 million more Americans have criminal convictions, criminal records. But here's something I invite us all to take a second and ingest. There are 333 million people in the United States of America. Yet, there are 113 million people who have an immediate family member whose lives have been immediately impacted by the criminal legal system. That is, it is possible that you, us, all quietly have someone in our lives who've been directly impacted by an unjust criminal legal system. Let me tell you the story of a young man who was born in abject poverty in Corona, Queens, New York. This young man, he didn't have a chance to live a meaningful life before he took his first breath. There were social scientists already figuring out metrics on how to pit that young man because he was black and lived in a impoverished community inside of a jail cell. That young man's great 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 grandmother was born on a slave plantation and endured the horrors of the transatlantic slavery. At 13, with no other choice, an undeveloped mind, that young man became a violent crack dealer. In the 1980s, during the height of the crack epidemic in New York City. 4 years later, at 17, this yet undeveloped mind was now incarcerated in the notorious New York City Rikers Island jail. He learned nothing. There was no rehabilitation to be had. So he was released with no rehabilitation in tow. Shortly after, he became a juvenile, one of the youngest members of a multi-state drug organization. Moved from New York to Boston, Massachusetts. Shortly thereafter, that young man, that undeveloped mind, murdered another young man, 19 years young. He accepted responsibility for that harm, but he was thrust in a system that was broken. He was thrust in a system that did not have a rehabilitative process that was culturally competent, that spoke to the needs of this demographic. Poor, over-policed, criminalized because of poverty. But something happened to that young man. He began to explore the knowledge of himself. And he said to himself, I am not what I did, but why did I do it? And the question of why began a process of restoration towards his humanity. And in that restoration process, that young man began to realize, poverty or not, he was rich with the faculty of love, of care, of community from his family. That young man was broken, or should I say, had a breakthrough when he realized that he caused harm not only to the individual that he murdered, but an entire ecosystem, that individual's family, that individual's community, his own family, and his own community. In that instance, he resolved that he would spend the rest of his life repairing harm wherever it showed up. He didn't know how it would happen just yet. Christmas Eve, 2010, in MCI Norfolk, Massachusetts' largest prison, a community, not unlike this campus here in Medford. A violent riot disrupted the relative calm of that prison. The young man was not so young anymore. The young man was an influencer of other men. The young man was a program developer, a mentor, a counselor, and an advisor to many. He resolved that it was his fault that these other young men who were the same age he was when he entered the prison were violently aggressing each other. And he said, I had to be held accountable for the harm in my community, but it must be done in a realistic way. So he authored a proposal entitled Building Community Through Restorative Justice, a public safety initiative for the residents of MCI Norfolk. From harming to healing, from irresponsible to responsibility. That proposal went on to create a life that is transformative by sheer essence of showing up in what we call restorative circles. In 2012, this very same young man stood in front of an auditorium, not unlike this one in front of 165 people. And he read a sincere public apology. But as he was reading and the tears were flowing from his eyes, he resolved that that apology would mean nothing if he could not influence the men younger than him and not so younger than him to also be involved with this process. That involvement has given birth to the Transformational Prison Project. The Transformational Prison Project has given birth to directors of community outreach, to business leaders, to true impact players in these same impoverished communities. Next, he would go on and he would found Responsible Party Consulting Group, a small yet experienced consulting agency that would give advice centered how do we repair harm, not only in impoverished communities this time, because we realize through these practices that we are part of a greater ecosystem we call the Weber relationship. So how do we repair harm on college campuses across the Commonwealth and our country? How do we repair harm in educational institutions, in financial institutions, in economic institutions? This is the charge of Responsible Party Consulting Group. This is the charge of that young man and every other young man that came after him in today's society. We are responsible parties. What is a responsible party? A responsible party is someone who stands up, publicly accepts responsibility for the harm she or he has caused, and says, I am willing to be held accountable in a realistic way of my community to repair this harm. A responsible party can be found anywhere. In fact, I see responsible parties here. I see them here. I see responsible parties over there. I see responsible parties in the essence of each and every one of us who sit in this audience this afternoon. But the challenge is, will you accept the call to be a responsible party? Will you challenge yourself to repair the harm within yourself, your interpersonal relationships, your workplace, your community, and in our nation? Once again, will you challenge yourself? Simon Sinek, the great public speaker, introduced me to the law of diffusion of innovation. The law of diffusion and innovation, simply stated, says that 2% of the people of any population in any society at any time are innovators, are leaders. So if 2% of the people are leaders and innovators, what is there to be said about the remaining 98%? Why are they laggards to these innovative, these new approaches? The question that I ask you, are you a part of the 2%? Will you be a responsible party? Will you endeavor to repair harm where you reside, in your relationships, in our nation? My name is Supreme Hassan, and I am a responsible party. And I ask you, if you are a responsible party, please stand up. And if this is something that you're not comfortable with just yet, sit down. I ask you to help me on a count of 3, and let's say it together. I am a responsible party. 1, 2, 3. I am a responsible party. Thank you.